I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for. Welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. As always, I'm very excited because today I've got Erik Wilde, who for many of you will not be an unknown. Erik has been active in the API space for a very long time. And as he says it, after joining the dark side, like leaving academia, around 15 years ago, he's been working in a variety of roles in architecture teams, in thought leadership teams, and in strategic issues around APIs and architecture. Erik is also active with the OpenAPI Initiative, where he helps to make the organization more visible and helps OpenAPI users to better understand the value of an organization OAI. And also, Erik, currently you're working for INNOQ. So what I understood is that they're a Swiss, like a local player. So that's a good characterization if you want like a custom API build or something like that. Or how do I understand what the company you're working for does?
First of all, thanks for having me, Christoph. It's good to see you here. We run into each other so much at some events around the globe. So it's nice to check in with you every now and then. Yeah, so INNOQ, so I'm working in Zurich because I'm based in Zurich, but the biggest part of INNOQ is actually in Germany, but it's a relatively small player, around 200 people. Mostly we do custom software development for companies who really need custom software to get their things done, where off-the-shelf software isn't good enough. And then that's something that we work with them to figure out how to build it and then really deliver software that exactly fits their needs.
So basically, if you're in Germany or in Switzerland or neighboring German-speaking countries, you're in luck because you can get like a global talent like Erik Wilde to work on your API. So yeah, that's a shout out. As
Thank you.
An agency owner, I know how important this is. And but besides this job, like you play a key role in the community, and that's why we're saying like you have a really big network, and it's not only in Europe but around the world. You're actually working on creating visibility for the OpenAPI Initiative. Can you maybe tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in standards literally all my life. I've always done something with standards. I don't know exactly why. Maybe that's a German thing. There have to be rules. But I think standards are very important, right? At some level, we all critically depend on standards or nothing would work. And I've been working for software vendors for a little while. That's how I got into the API space, where, of course, standards like OpenAPI play a big role. And now for the last, now it's a little over a year that I've been with INNOQ. And a little bit longer, I've worked with the OpenAPI Initiative as we call them OAI Ambassador, whatever. My role is basically just to do outreach work for the OpenAPI Initiative, to make sure that the standard is healthy, that the standards gets the input that it needs from the community, that the standards keeps evolving, that OAI also understands what the community needs. And that's one of the main things why I'm traveling a fair bit to conferences. So I'm organizing these OAI tracks where I think you've been speaking in one of our tracks as well. And we just try to raise awareness for people that if you live in that software world where you depend on interoperability, it doesn't just happen by itself. It happens because some people put in the work and some standards are establishing the foundation. And the more we build that awareness, I think the better the chances are that we all end up with standards that are useful, that keep evolving, and that help everybody in the community, the vendors, the users, and everybody who's building up the ecosystem around it, like yourself, right? I mean, your company also heavily depends on standards, and there are a lot of cases like this.
So was it also already in your academic work that you're like interested in standards? Like, how was that connected?
So when I studied quite a while ago, I studied computer science. And back then, for the older ones among your viewers, you might remember OSI, Open Systems Interconnection. Back then, it was the European alternative to the internet. As we all know, the internet won. But a long time ago, there was this alternative view of how a protocol stack could actually look like and function. It was better engineered, but it was pretty heavy and complicated. So in the end, it didn't win. But this is how I got into the standard space. And then when I did my PhD, I also worked on standards around, back then, it was around multicasting. So you can send data that gets routed to multiple recipients. That, of course, also needs standards so that in the network, all the routing takes place and so forth. And it has always been, it started out with more like these communication system standards, a little bit lower level. And then it moved up a little bit to web technologies and these kind of things. And that's a level where I have been working on for quite a while now.
And the standards, like it feels like sometimes things take very long and then sometimes go really fast. So
I think I know what you're leading up to.
Yes. But before dropping that hint, but then before I pick onto that one, but like I think recently there's been a lot of talk around the Arazzo specification. And can you tell maybe a little bit more about that and how you've been involved in that one?
Yeah, Arazzo is, let's say, politically, so to speak, it's interesting because the OpenAPI Initiative for the longest time just had one standard, the OpenAPI standard. And Arazzo is the second standard that was created within the OpenAPI Initiative, which kind of is an interesting thing, just that now OAI has more than one standard. And what Arazzo does is it's a workflow specification that allows you to describe how multiple API invocations are combined. It's either within the same API or it can be across APIs, because very rarely you can get useful things done with one API interaction. Yeah. In most cases, there's a certain sequence where you say, okay, if I do these 5 things, then I can accomplish something. And it was always hard to describe these things, to document them, to test them, to just get to that level where it's not just individual endpoints and interactions with those, but really the sequences of these interactions. And that's what Arazzo is doing. And what has been interesting, so it was launched, now it's almost a year ago, I think last May, I think it was in May or in June. I don't remember quite, but it was a year ago, let's say. And the interesting thing is we did a lot of presentations also at these events where we have these OAI tracks. So it was mostly Frank Kilcommons, who I think is chairing that working group or co-chairing it. He did a lot of those presentations. And the interesting thing was always, it's not really something that you have to sell a lot. If you explain to people what it does, everybody says, yeah, I get it. Sounds useful. Give it to me. It was a very easy sell because people always had this understanding that, yes, APIs are useful, but they're also at a little low level. So that's an interesting thing. And also there were always really good interactions with people at these events who were asking questions about it. We see quite a bit of support coming up with individual vendors who start supporting Arazzo in their different products. Sometimes it's documentation products, sometimes it's testing. There are a variety of angles that you can take, but it's something where it seems that there has been a gap in the landscape. And like you said, some standards take quite a while to catch on. Standards never make it, right? Yeah. People think it's a good idea and then it never takes off. I think Arazzo is looking good. Still a little early. A year is not very long for a standard to exist. So we'll see how it goes. But in my mind, what I see is really interesting is that it also, with all the AI hype now, where you want some descriptions that provide a little bit better context and glue and say, to get this done, do these 5 things in this order. So I think there's a lot of potential there to have a well-defined description of these workflows that has a solid foundation that can be shared across tools, that maybe can be used, for example, in AI tooling. And therefore, I'm really optimistic about the success, the long-term success of Arazzo, but we'll see, right? It's a little early.
Like for me, it feels that because it's like describing a sequence of interactions, probably it could find interesting applications in the agentic space, like where you can say, okay, I need this sequence, and now it's predefined what we're going to do, and it's not just trying to make things up as we go.
But the thing is, what I see, a lot of people get a little bit, I would say, confused or misled or whatever about the specification is they want it to be almost like an executable thing, right? That they can just run, basically. They could take a workflow in Arazzo and just say, basically, press a run button and then it runs. And the language is not rich enough for that. There are a lot of bits and pieces missing there, where if you had like complex transformations that you have to do between different invocations, right? This is just, you just do it in there. It's not meant to be a Turing complete language, right? Which is probably good. But that means, right, there still is probably some gaps that need to be filled in. But at least I think it gives you a better understanding of the context where your APIs fit in and how you can use and combine them than what we had before. So we'll see. And I'm really hopeful that we will see maybe some extensions popping up that solve some of these problems, and then maybe the community picks them up or it doesn't. But we'll see about that.
Yeah. And then we were already talking a little bit about AI. So we were hinting about some standards that go a little bit faster. So my LinkedIn feed is full. Like, I think half of the content I'm seeing passing by is MCP. and
probably half of that is me.
Actually,
probably not.
There's a lot of also in the Drupal community.
Yeah.
I was at Drupal Dev Days last week, and they were demonstrating how you could basically expose all these content management capabilities inside of Drupal as tools using MCP, and then like also plugging in external tools. Like they showed how you update the node, or when somebody files a comment, you get an SMS from Twilio, and all like really easily set up using MCP. But do you want to maybe give a short for people that haven't heard of MCP yet? Because I know there's some people out there. Can you maybe do a short intro? What does MCP mean for you?
Okay, for those of you who have been on vacation for the last 6 months, very good for you. No, it's not even 6 months, it's maybe 3. Yeah, so MCP is something that was launched by Anthropic, and it's called the Model Context Protocol. And what it does is it's almost like a plugin mechanism for an LLM-based application. So the way I've used it so far, and I think how most people have used it who just play around with it, is you can set up your Claude desktop. So that's just a desktop app version of Claude, which basically is the same as ChatGPT, just an LLM that you can interact with. And then in that Claude desktop, you can configure MCP servers, and the MCP servers then become tools that your Claude desktop can invoke. And it does so because it understands that you're asking for something that it has a tool for. And when it thinks that it can use that tool, then it asks you, should I do that? It seems like that is something I should be doing. And then you say yes. And then basically it goes off and sends a request to the MCP server, which can be anything. The way I look at it, of course, is that for me, it looks like a very natural way of wrapping an API, but it doesn't have to be that way. It also, there are MCP servers for many things, and not all of them are APIs. It can be anything, any code that you expose that way. But that's the way that I'm most interested in. So, for example, one of my colleagues, what he recently did is he wrote a little system where we can just log times. When we work for a customer, we can just log times. And of course, we had a web interface for it where you type it into a table. And he wrote a little MCP server for it. And now you can basically just type that into your Claude and say, hey, today I worked for 3 hours and I did that. And then it goes off and asks you, hey, should I insert that into your worksheet? And then it does that. You're done. So that's the kind of things that you can do relatively easily. And I think that is what gets everybody excited because, of course, ChatGPT and Claude are great, but they always were a little isolated. Yeah. They couldn't really do much because basically they're just the models that you can interact with. And MCP, I think, is the first large-scale way how this becomes accessible. I had high hopes. I don't know if you remember that when OpenAPI first, it was called OpenAPI plugins, I think, when they first exposed that. And I thought, oh, that's cool. So that was a way how you could directly plug in an OpenAPI into OpenAI.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And your API had to follow certain constraints, right? It could only return this much data, and it had to be described in a way so that the LLM understands it and so forth. And that didn't really take off. Yeah. I was hopeful when it came out, but it seemed like this was not generating as much buzz as I thought it might. And MCP is the exact opposite, right?
Yeah, I think that's what I understand is that what because I think that's the OpenAPI plugin. I think that was the custom GPTs, right? That's that you're talking about, or
that's the newer version of that. So they first launched it and it was called plugins, and then they created these custom GPTs where you can also drop in some content, and now it's part of that. Yes.
So for me, it felt an attempt to create a marketplace that can be controlled. And we've all been there before. We know how this plays out. And I think a lot of people did not want to have a plugin that they had to maintain on OpenAI's infrastructure, and then whatever business model they would come up with. That's the story arc from hype, oh, it's amazing, and then the enshittification that ensues. And then I think that's probably what most people did not want. So for me, that's why I think the MCP protocol, it feels like a network protocol for this, and that feels like a more natural fit because it's an open, or I think it's an open protocol for it, but I don't know. I see the facial expressions.
I've never thought about it exactly that way, but yes, I think you have a point. I think the difference how I would put it is more that MCP may be better suited for, let's say, composable scenarios, right? You could say, I drop like 10 tools into my Claude thingy, and I don't need to pick which of these tools I interact with. That just happens naturally through my conversation. And then my LLM just picks the tool that I maybe should work with right now. So that's nice because in custom GPT, all of these are these fenced off individual things, right? Yeah. So I think that alone maybe is interesting. And then the other thing for sure is that, yes, it's more decentralized.
Yeah.
But it's also, and I have to admit that I don't follow that super closely, but I know that a couple of people in my company, they follow that very closely. And there's a good number of risks with all of this, right? Because everybody now is creating these MCP servers. A lot of them come from not authoritative sources, right? So you can have any kind of MCP servers for popular software packages, and then you just download them basically from anywhere, and you have no idea what they're doing. The security model
that's not there
yet. Really there.
It's coming now. There's a new version of the protocol. Yes, but even that is not.
There's a new version. But so, for example, what I had to do just to highlight one of the things that I found okay for experimentation, right? But for that keeping app that we have, now what I had to do is I had to generate an API key in the app. The API key identifies me, right, and authorizes access. And then I have to basically copy paste that API key into configuration in Claude Desktop. And then it works because then the Claude Desktop, the MCP server there, can authenticate to our server and to the right interaction. But now I have all these, and that's something that just we did because we had to and wanted to make this secure. But everybody can do that in a different way. And there's no, let's say, managed key store or any kind of thing that would make it easier to manage that in a reliable way. And I'm sure you have a lot of people checking in code that contains keys because you need to have the keys somewhere, right? So GitHub probably has seen like 1 million more API keys just showing up in some public repos, right? So all of this, I think, is right now is a little not so great, but there's a lot of momentum. And all of this, I think, is fixable. It's not like we don't have technologies that we could slot in. I don't think right now we have the best architecture in place to make it work. So that remains to be seen. But like you said, there was a new version that was released, I don't know, like around 3 weeks ago, I think.
Yeah, or I think it was last week even. Because,
or last week, yeah.
It's very short. It's going
probably
fast.
Just this morning.
Yeah.
But I think that also did not really address that part. And maybe that's also the part that is very specific to us being interested in APIs, where we say, our interest in MCP is basically to be a wrapper around APIs to surface those in LLMs. And then that part, we want to be secure, ideally also in ways that work well with existing APIs that we have.
Yeah.
And that's not even the primary design goal of MCP, right? It just happens to be a nice fit for that, but it's not really part of the core MCP specification at all.
And it's, I think that the most valuable part of this whole story is actually the hype with which it's being promoted and the speed with which it goes, because it's creating so much momentum for adoption. There's this massive fear of missing out, like nothing ever before. Everybody's afraid that they're going to miss this train. And that is like really accelerating a lot of interesting things. Like for forever, Zdenek has been talking forever about automating API connections.
Yeah. He's just sitting there now all the time. I said, I told you.
Yes. So it feels that this is, it's definitely something in that direction. It's going slightly different, off track in a slightly different way, but it's fascinating. And yeah, I think that it feels that for me, I've been thinking about the whole AI stuff, not so much as intelligence, but more as in like disclosing a bunch of stuff that we're able to do with software, and now making it like removing a certain barrier to that. And like that there's an activation energy for software that has been lowered because this thing can guess. and because it can guess, a couple of times. Now that activation energy, as long as you're okay with guesses, actually falls away, and that's incredibly powerful, and that is really changing the scope of what software can do. And
but I'm still super curious to see how this will impact the space that we play in, like the API space in general. So, for example. And coming back to this one thing, because I've had so many discussions around it, right? Our timekeeping thing. So our timekeeping thing has a relatively simple cruddy API, right? And now, when you give instructions and say, book this on this project, right? Today I worked 3 hours for this project. Now it starts, if it doesn't find that particular project, now it just starts creating new projects, assuming that, well, if you work for this, then probably this project exists, right? So now it starts violating certain business rules, I would say, that ideally probably should have been like enforced in the API, maybe different roles, and then these kind of things, right? But I think it may, because you said it guesses, right? And that's the kind of interesting thing to me. It's if you have well-defined APIs, then that guessing may be okay, because your API basically will make sure that if it guesses wrong, then okay, things don't happen. But if you have these kind of really anemic APIs that allow you to do anything, assuming that you're going to use it right, I think we may see actually more problems getting to us, because before people had to write bad code to misuse the API, right? So that was quite a hurdle. Now they just have to say the bad things through some LLM, right? And then the API will just be misused that way. So these are the kinds of trickle-down effects where I'm really wondering, is will we see that maybe in our space, where people start really saying, you know what, these CRUD APIs, not great. Maybe they should be more kind of domain-oriented and these kind of things. Yeah. So I think it's a little early in the game for those things to show up now. But I think something is going to show up in our space, that where we get feedback from these classes of users we just haven't had before. And that's going to be interesting.
It reminds me of the whole docs as code story, because this has been also a pet peeve of mine, that like developers, they just prefer just in their IDE to just write in Markdown, just get it done, get away with your stupid CMS interfaces. I don't want to touch that stuff. But then that means that you now need input validation at another level, and that the constraints fall away. So you have a Markdown, like you where you can do whatever you want, and then maybe like your metadata, maybe it's in the front matter or something. But like, how do you validate that you're fulfilling any kind of business logic that you need that content to adhere to? And then what I've seen happening is that those constraints are moved into the people. So now people need to remember to do it the right way, which is not a very good way. But in a really small, tight documentarian team, you can play that game. And then as a next step, you start having linters and like you're developing this whole validation model all over again. And it feels very similar to that. It's like this, if you have a lack of, if your constraints are not adapted to, to the, like what the backend needs, then you get all kinds of bad stuff happening. And
yeah, I think we will see a fair share of bad stuff happening.
Yeah.
And like you said, I would also assume that having people as the ones enforcing business constraints is probably not a great idea.
It's not a great idea, no.
It doesn't scale well, right? It doesn't automate well. So there are a lot of just technical issues around it, but also just safety, right? Sometimes in some industries, you're just not allowed to do that. You have to, everything needs to be, it needs to be a way how you can explain how certain things, how certain decisions were taken and all these kind of things, right? Everything has to be product logged and then these kind of things. So I think, and in my mind, almost like APIs have a good chance of becoming this line of defense where it's like, here is where things start happening deterministically. Yeah. And the really important constraints are actually enforced underneath that level. And then up there, yes, be my guest, chat your life away. But we won't let you do just everything just because now it's so easier to just do it.
Yeah. And I think, but there's always this push against the boundaries, like these constraints. There was this story, this is an old story. It's from 13, 14 years ago in the Drupal community. And there was a content architect who was telling the story about a large publishing company, I think, if I remember correctly. And they had, after a lot of thinking, they had built this amazing content model that had all the metadata. Like it was, now they finally had a content model that could handle mobile screens, whatever output you needed, you could do it as. And everybody hated it because it was this really long form that you had to fill out. And so it's this, I hope that with filling out these forms, filling out these derivatives were the bureaucratic part. I hope that's where us can help. Although they can guess at it, at least. But
Yeah, I have to admit, personally, I have not spent as much time as I would like to just playing around with chatbots. But I think there's a lot of potential when I see those people in my company who invest a lot of time into this, when I see how they interact, how they build their prompts, how they try to make sure that life is made as easy as possible for them. They have already, and it hasn't been that long, but they already have developed pretty impressive, I would say, strategies how to best do that.
Yeah.
And it allows them to work very effectively. I think that's the kind of division of labor I would say, where like underneath the API, there just need to be certain business rules that just need to be enforced. And that I would hope is something that is hard-coded or deterministically coded somewhere, also for automation and high volume tasks and all these kind of things. And then you have this more convenient way of interacting with it, which may give you all these things that used to be very complicated. Like you said, right now you had to fill out all these complicated things because the model was relatively complex. But that is probably a task that an LLM can do relatively easy for you once you explain a little bit, what you're working on, what your preferences are, what you want to get done. And then like oftentimes it may not do 100% what you do, but as long as it cannot do something very destructive, right? Then it's maybe a good way to separate those things that are essential for the organization to function well, and then for what people need to do to actually get stuff done.
What is your take on? So I've got a few story arcs I'd love to hear your opinion on that I've been building for a while. So one is the story arc of API products, like your Wardley maps. I am pretty sure we've talked about this in the past.
I'm sure we have.
Yeah. For me, that was like this big eye opener, like the evolution of technology as it industrializes, from inception to custom to product to commodity and utility. To go from product to commodity utility you need the standards, because without the I think that, or do you need the standards maybe to go from project to product already? Or where would you actually put standards? What is their role that they play? It's not only to enable products, right? It's really to enable commodities, so that there's a standardization of how you do things, so that they become interchangeable.
That's a big question. So, I mean, you always use standards at some level, even for super Genesis-like stuff, right, where you do some very innovative things. You still depend on some standards, how to get stuff done, how to interface with others, and so forth. I think it's just the level of freedom, right, that probably gets smaller and smaller. If something is just delivered to you as a commodity or utility, whatever that is, right, you don't really need a lot of choices. You just, right, do I need a lot of that, or do I need not as much of it? And then that's as good as it gets. And so there's a very low variability in how you can consume those things. I'm just making stuff up now. But
that's what we're here for.
I would assume that the more you get away from that end of the spectrum, the more probably the standards are still there, but they allow much more variation on top of it, right? If you look at OpenAPI, of course, it's a standard, but on the other hand, there's a huge amount of variability, how you write your schemas, how you design your URI space, how you design your responses, and all these kind of things, right? So even though it is a standard, you can build many things with it, and you are not very constrained. You are constrained in some shape or form because you're using HTTP and these kind of things, right? But there's still a lot of freedom in it. And I think that's where the standards start maybe changing in nature a little bit, that they become more and more prescriptive and not just enabling and allowing you to do many different things.
Alicia Guerrero, one of my favorite authors, she talks about how complex systems start with enabling constraints that then become constitutive constraints and then become governing constraints. I hear an echo of that story in what you just said. Yeah.
Maybe. I just made that up on the fly, so please don't check it too carefully. But that was just my quick take on the ideas that you were talking about.
But I think there is the thing I've been banging my head on for a very long time is, so we talk a lot always about APIs as products. So APIs should be products, they should not be projects. And that's fine. That's a good, no discussion there. But then is there something that comes after APIs as a product? Is there API as a utility? And so one of the things that I've been looking at MCP for is, could this be that next step? But it's, I guess it's at a different layer than the OpenAPI standard, because it does create something where you don't need to do as much negotiation about. Like when you have an OpenAPI standards and you have an API product, you build a product and you have to really think it through, make it, and that's really important. But then also the implementation, when you want to consume that, then again, you need to do some work. And it feels that at least the promise is there that this now might change, and that we might go towards self-connecting APIs, what Zdenek has been talking about for a very long time. Or how do you see that as that, or is it something else still?
That's a story I don't think I will ever buy into that one. That has been following me through my whole career with, I don't know, like formal logic when I started, and then the whole semantic web craze. And
yes,
some people always had this idea that if we only describe the whole world in a formally complete way, look at all the things we could be doing. I'm still not holding my breath. I think that's probably a healthy thing to do. But what I find interesting is it might get easier for that class of consumers, right? Because we always had, I think, one of the really complicated or really hard problems for that community was to create those ontologies, right? They always had this idea of, if we formalize all of the knowledge of the world that we have, then we can sort everything in. Which at some level maybe is true, or a little bit true. But they always had a really hard time, understandably, to do that beyond any kind of very small domain, right? Because it's a gigantic task to do that. And very quickly, you also realize that it's not that easy to create a model that fits all the different variations of things you actually see out there, right? Some things are not actually easy to align, right? So things get complicated. But what I find interesting is that with MCP, we now may be able to rely more on like human language things, right? Where again, we would describe those things for LLM consumption. And people would have an easier way of using those things, and they might get it wrong sometimes because it's not that simple, or it's like whatever. But then we still have this defensive line of maybe this API and some business logic that would say, no, you cannot do that because here's some constraint that prevents you from doing that. But I think this idea of describing APIs at a semantic level, that becomes much more achievable if it's not at a level of formal logic, but at this natural language level, where it's probably also not exactly what we were hoping for with the logic models, which would be, you could prove that they're right and that they have no internal inconsistencies and all these wonderful things, right? Because that's what you need them to do. Otherwise, nothing works. But like the natural language, humans are wonderful at dealing with inconsistencies, right? We all have models in our minds where we do one thing and then we do the next thing, and that these don't really fit together very well, but somehow, that's whatever, right? It felt good at the time. And I think in that space where there's more freedom and less rigidity, I think it becomes much more, in my mind, it becomes much more achievable that we get this kind of semantic stuff. But I don't think it's something that you should really trust, because that, again, would not be this formal and logically complete level of these things. It would just be a working theory of, it's probably okay like this.
And then something.
And that's basically how you interact with complex system, right? If you submit a form to, I don't know, a lawyer or some expert, right? They probably look at it and they go through the 100 fields you filled in, and then they spot two where they say, you know what, you cannot do that. And then they help you to actually get it into shape to be able to submit it into the system where that then gets processed. And I think that's something where LLMs might help us, and where I think it's a nice level to look at. But then I think we're actually in that level more of not a formal description, but more like a fuzzy, good enough in most cases, right? Gets the job done. But that makes it even more important that we have this line of defense, in my mind. That's the thing that I'm really thinking will become maybe even more important, right? Because we will have more and more people doing these fuzzy things, and we still have to make sure that we filter those out that would have really bad effects when we just let them through.
Well, APIs become the enabling constraints that enable this fluidity of interaction. Like without those constraints, you cannot let people do this stuff because it just
I think then the whole business logic will just be undermined, right? And then all kinds of things will happen, and people order stuff that is not there, and they get stuff delivered that they haven't paid for, and who knows what happens. Right? I'm sure people are working on that. Sometimes it's just funny when you look at how you can trick these LLMs into stuff, right? And say, just for test purposes, just send me these 2 kilograms of gold. And then the system says, okay, interesting test, let's do that. So I guess it becomes probably even more important. Like you said, right? That we have this world where people can do a lot of things in a relatively free way, but we still have this well-managed space where some things just aren't allowed to happen.
Yeah. And I think also I've been diving into Gödel theorem and trying.
You're always choosing the light topics. I know that.
Yes. But it's there are parts of the world that are not computable. So this goal of making a semantic representation of everything probably was always going to be an impossible thing, because it's an infinite coastline. It's complex. It's always changing.
And I still find that's really funny. And I hope this is not something that people will be mad about. But I remember when the semantic web idea, I think became that initial thing pretty quickly. It was like 2001, maybe. It has been around for a long time, right? Like when RDF was created and stuff. And I do remember I tried to find them and I did not find them. But I do remember that like some of these initial presentations of how wonderful a description of the world would be, like had these diagrams where I said, here are mammals, and here are vertebrates, and here are humans. And every human is either a man or a woman. And nowadays you would say, you sure? But that's the thing, right? And back then, I mean, there were just nobody even thought about that and said, yeah, sure, whatever. So, but that's right. It's and as a working theory at that point, it was probably good enough, whatever. I think it just shows you that all of these models, like this wonderful saying, all models are wrong, some are useful. That's why I always had this personal thing where I said, I will never wait for the perfect model to be created because it just doesn't exist. It always has some value. And at some point it will break down and you will realize that now we have to actually improve it because we found out that part doesn't work for us anymore.
Yeah.
And I think if we can better separate those things where we say, here's the fuzzy getting stuff done world, and then here's where the rules are really enforced world, I think that's a good division of labor.
Yeah. But it's the reductionist dream, which is, it's a fallacy that you can just reduce everything to computable, that everything is going to be computable and that you can turn it into, It's interesting that it's like bureaucracy, this reductionist dream or nightmare, depending on how you look at it. It's like a huge project. I think software has been playing a very big role in this project of trying to put everything in boxes and to simplify everything into a few properties.
It makes it easier to deal with things, to scale things, to automate things. And all these things are in itself not bad, I think. The fact that we have automated so many things definitely has a lot of really good side effects for us, right? There are so many things we can do nowadays that just wouldn't be possible if we hadn't automated so much stuff. But then, of course, there are, and there always will be, I'm sure, right? These stories where it's always the system doesn't let me do this or something like this, whereas the system didn't do that. Somebody just programmed it that way.
Yeah.
and I think that I think is the other thing, right? As long as you understand that this is not an imperfection, but it's just a fact of how things are. And you always make sure that you can fix that if you decide that it's worth fixing, right? And you say, okay, now this has happened 10 times and we think it's really an issue, right? So let's fix it. And then you should build your system so that you can fix those easily. That was always coming back a little bit to my semantic web stuff, right? Like it was always it only worked with the perfection world, right? And so that is really hard to do. And I think if it's more iterative and you have a much more kind of pragmatic way of saying, these are the rules that we have for now, and we've also built it so that we can actually patch them pretty easily without having to rebuild everything.
Yeah.
I think, and that actually might become even more important now, right? With more and more like of these LLM things happening and people creating all kinds of situations where we might also ask ourselves, okay, maybe we should allow more or allow less, whatever, change a little bit of the constraints that we build into our software. But I think that's one of the things that will remain very important, that we never assume that what we build is something that should just remain static.
And I think, to me, as you're talking, I hear an echo of the whole SOA versus contemporary APIs story, where there was this original dream that there was a single context in which we could build a coherent system so that you could create one single XML that was going to drive coherence across your whole organization or your whole industry. And now this one XML had everything that you had to be able to do was embedded in this thing. But then any small change how do you see that? Yeah.
First, I really don't understand all the SOA hate. I don't like the tech stack. I think it's a crappy tech stack, but I think if you used it, I think it was not so bad at the time. And that's the part that nobody ever used that. But do you remember the term UDDI?
So I don't, but yeah.
See, so UDDI was actually, and nobody remembers that because nobody ever used it. But in the original SOAP story, there was SOAP for kind of the payloads, and there was WSDL for the description of the interfaces, and then there was UDDI for the discovery of those descriptions. So they had a model where they said there have to be various services that you have to be able to discover based on some discovery mechanism and so forth. And that part really never played out so well. But I think in theory, at least they had the right bits and pieces in place. The technologies weren't great, that much I would agree on. But I think mostly it was just used in a really bad way. I don't think it was the fault of the approaches back then. It was just like the way how people built things with it were just so mistaken. And that kind of tainted the whole thing.
That's interesting. So basically, we needed a new generation of standards to free us from the bad social practices that had sprung up. And is that
I think,
what happened?
The SOA space, I think the big problem there was it was all people trying to build systems, right? Like we just need to design and build a system. And that is, I think, the fundamental flaw in that thinking, that if you think along those lines, you make all kinds of really bad decisions.
Yeah.
And that's where web services changed that. Even a web service, let's say, not the SOAP web services, but the REST web services. Right? But I think those were much more from a point of view where you don't think about we're building a system. It's more like we're actually using the ecosystem of the web to connect machines, right?
Yeah.
But we're not having the goal of building one giant system.
Yeah, the perfect company software.
The perfect thing, right? Where the web is a system, right?
Yeah.
And I think, and of course, this distinction between system and ecosystem there is a little fuzzy, and you could argue around whether these are good words to use there. But that was always my personal interpretation of why the SOAP-based SOA really didn't work out, because these were system builders.
Yeah.
And you still see that sometimes nowadays with people even using OpenAPI, right? That they're still coming from this system mindset and not with an ecosystem approach. And I think that leads you to all kinds of decisions that you will regret later, I think, necessarily at some point. But
I think it's the difference between using APIs as interfaces in between systems versus using them as tools to program the state of a system. Because I think that the mistake is that when you're trying to describe the state of your system, then you're pouring concrete into the system and you're really heavily constraining it, too much actually, so that it no longer is as adaptive as it should be. And I think this is probably the same with semantic web. If you believe that you're creating one ontology for everything instead of domain language to communicate, although maybe the domain language is used inside of the system. So like there's these islands of coherence where that holds true. But then probably it's like you have islands of coherence where you have a domain language where you can have consistency. But then you have interfaces between those islands and you just have to make sure that you're using the right tool for the right job. That is that what we're doing?
Sometimes I have to admit, I have a little trouble following your train of thought, but it's always interesting to try to do that because it makes me think along interesting lines. I get if you follow the DDD argument a little bit, right? You definitely want to have kind of these islands of coherence where everybody would agree on, okay, this is what we do here, right? That needs to be coherent. Otherwise, you have a problem. But that doesn't need to be what somebody else is doing.
Yeah.
It can be the opposite of what somebody else is doing because that's what you decide to do. And I think that's where some of these problems then come up, where if you want to synthesize that into one coherent way of how the world works, right, you realize that, nope. So you have, to make sure you get a lot of comments in one domain, you have this model where you say a person is either a man or a woman,
Yeah.
And then in another model, you have one that says, no, person. And I don't even know, how is it in Belgium now? In Germany, I think now they have 5 different entries you can have for the gender or something. I don't know. But it varies, right? Like now you have countries where there's still 2, you have countries where there's 3, there are countries where there's 5, right? And none of that basically allows you to say there is one consistent model of what the gender of a person is, right? It depends just on under which kind of authority, so to speak, you make that decision, right? And somebody says it's like this, and yes, it's like that. And there's no way how you can synthesize that into one model that is just the model of how that works.
What is going to be the role of these different parts? Because it feels like, so I had this conversation, and I've mentioned this a few times, maybe even to you already. So I was at a conference and there was somebody from a political institution and talking about banking APIs. I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'll go ask him, like, do you want to be on my podcast? And he's like, oh, no, because I'm not sure that APIs are here to stay. I was like, what? Like, why? Yeah, AI.
Tell me more.
It was like, and that was like this, what? And so it feels like there's this challenge to these standards that we've built up over time, like domain modeling, some semantic stuff in some small niches, like different API standards. And they're all being tested again against this new big tsunami of change that comes bouldering in. And I don't know how does it all evolve. It feels to me that both documentation and APIs only become much, much more important, because without good documentation, whatever you're feeding your LLM is going to, if you're just depending on the knowledge that's embedded in the model, it's not a good idea, because that's like I had a podcast interview with Jeff Eaton, and he called it like a compressed image of the world. Just the same way that you have a JPEG where you have a picture and you like compress it, and like that's the LLM model of language. And but it's so I think you need even more documentation, or maybe now finally we will actually document everything, because without it will not work. And the same thing, maybe now we'll create good APIs with proper constraints, because without them everything will go haywire. Is this what's going to happen, or what do you feel?
Like I said, I mean, I think so. I'm not sure, but my bet would be that good APIs will become even more important, because they will allow all these exciting applications to interact with you and to do the things that they need to get done. An LLM cannot order something or book a flight or something. It needs to talk to somebody who's doing those things, and that's not going to go away. At least I can't see how this part is going away. And so you need these kind of interactions, right? You need this interface between whatever that AI thing is and those parts of the world that are not in that compressed world. And as we discussed, right, I think it becomes more important that we make sure that we only allow the things to happen that we think should happen. And then we can probably allow a lot of interesting things to evolve in that new space. In my mind, it's very similar. So a long time ago, and I'm sure you've also run into this, right? There was this, like, the integration layer basically was the database, right? Everybody was working on the database. And the assumption was that people will follow the logic of how the database should be used, that you had to understand how the table and pointers and whatever, right? And it worked. It was just very brittle, and it was hard to scale. And over time, people said, that's actually holding us back, right? It's not the level of abstraction that we need when we build more and more software. And I think we're at exactly the same time now, just a little bit different level, right? But it's the same kind of thing, where if we have a level of abstraction that is safe and allows people to do the things that they want to do, then I think that AI world will really push API traffic through the roof. But we'll see how that goes. But so one example, as I like running and cycling and stuff. I'm on Strava, like many people. Strava has an API, and Strava is also pretty bad at some things. It's very good for capturing your activity data and stuff, but it's really bad for simple things, such as asking, which runs have I done in Paris? It's basically impossible to find that out with Strava because that's not the focus that they have, and that's fine. That's just, right? But through the API, actually, it would be almost trivial to just say, go through all of the feed, look at all the GPS tracks, right? Match that with whatever Paris is, and then just return those that have been in Paris, right? So the logic for this is actually trivial, but it's hard to build an application for that. And I'm lazy, so I never did it. I always dreamt about it, but I haven't done it. But I think these are the kinds of things, right? If you had like an agent that would do that for you, right? Where you would say, take the city limits of Paris, look through my Strava activities and tell me which activities happened within those limits, right? It's mechanically, it's trivial to do.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of these things out there that people could easily describe how to do them, but it was never a business case to actually turn that into code. But if you now have the machinery that just does that for you, and maybe not even perfect, maybe it gets something wrong, but it's
who cares?
Fine. I think then that alone would push the traffic for some of these things so much higher up, right? Because now they're getting used for all these kind of things where it's not exactly in the business model of the provider, or maybe it's in their backlog for 8 years from now. But now you can just do it on the spot if you just describe your problem a little bit. And I think that's the kind of scenario that we will soon see happening more and more. And then the question will be, can actually the providers keep up with that? That's what I was thinking, because, for example, on Strava, I have 5,000 activities because I have been using it for a long time. Now, if my agent starts downloading 5,000 activities from Strava, they might not like that. Actually, they have a throttling policy in place. So and maybe they have to adjust that, and maybe there's a way now where you can cache that more effectively. I don't know. But I think these are all the interesting things where we will see just new usage patterns emerging, where it's not so much just if somebody takes the energy and the time to write code to do that, but just if somebody has the idea to do that, it actually ideally should be possible to do. And that might really change the way how APIs are used, I think.
At the same time, like, you see how Spotify has closed down parts of their API. You've seen how Twitter closed down part of their API. Yep. LinkedIn, like all of these tools, they've been closing down their APIs. And there's, as it becomes easier to create new applications, the checking of, is this a use case I want to allow? Or is this a use case actually I don't want to allow? Also, like, how to create the boundary around that use case. Because like we have now an application that could be doing whatever. So you have an LLM application, basically could be trying to do whatever. And even when you request a key, it afterwards might be doing something completely different. So there's some really hairy problems there. And
business models will have to adapt for sure.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes these gigantic single providers like Spotify and LinkedIn and Twitter and who knows what, right? Of course, these are very visible and there's a lot of data there, but these are just one tiny speck in the millions and probably billions of APIs out there, right? And they have very clear business models, right? Yes, they might not be interested in supporting huge amounts of traffic with kind of questionable return of investment for them, right? But on the other hand, for example, I pay Strava already because I like it. I'd be happy to pay $5 more to upgrade my API quota a little bit. I'd do that, right? If then I could use all these services that I would like to use, but that they don't provide, but they have the data, right? And I could pay a little bit extra and say, hey, make my data more easily usable for me because that's what I want to do. right? Then I think companies might find ways of doing that. And maybe they have to also invest more into just scalability of the infrastructure and these kind of things. But I think these are all just very interesting technical things that I think we will start seeing pretty soon.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
There is a lot of the places where we currently store our data, or where our data is being stored, are built up around business models that heavily depend on the graphical user interfaces through which we are accessing that data. So I don't know if our current ecosystem of data stores, of sources of truth, if they will, like there's the innovators, like the innovators dilemma? No, what's the name?
There is an innovators dilemma, yes.
That's the one where, if you're an incumbent in a market that you don't want to change because like you're going to lose your money. That's the one, right? Or no?
Yeah, that basically you have so many established paths of how you satisfy your customers, right? That it's easier to get disrupted over time because you have more customers that you have to make happy, right?
So I wonder if the current generation of SaaS applications, if they will be able to adapt, because their business model all depend on this graphical user interface models, on locking in customers into their experiences.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point there will be some label that says agent friendly, or something like this, right? Where they have figured out, and I mean, there could be, like I said, like this problem of these 5,000 activities that you have to download, which actually are pretty sizable chunks of data. I am guessing there would be some way how you can outsource that into Cloudflare or whatever, like some other of these massively scalable things where you would say, instead of always having to go through them, right, you actually make that much more scalable. And if there's enough money in doing that, I would assume that patterns like this might start emerging. I don't really know. That's just guessing. But I think there are technologies and infrastructure patterns that are amazingly scalable and that can work with that. And if there also are business models that then align with that, I think we could see some interesting things happening. But yes, that definitely is something where it remains to be seen. But I do think that this whole agent stuff something pretty remarkable will happen in that space, with a lot more automation going on and just little pieces of software trying to get stuff done for me. And that will have an impact. And how the ecosystem reacts to that, we'll see. But I think it will be big enough that we will see that impact. There will be some changes, which is a extremely precise way of predicting the future. There will be things, and things will happen.
And it will be all different.
Yes, and it will be different after it changed.
It's now breakneck speed. It would be nice if we would go a little bit slower.
Oh yes,
yeah.
Yes, please make it slower if you can, please. Yes,
Magic
that
wand.
Would be good for me.
Yeah. At the same time, I guess this is also how we make our money, like dealing with all these changes.
Yeah, but now it's just earlier this week, I looked at the call for proposals for some conferences in fall, right? And now they ask you to submit your abstracts and stuff. And you basically, it's like, how do I know what's going to be interesting in fall? This is going to be about probably AI stuff, whatever seems appropriate in October. So yeah, I mean, we're definitely running a little bit against some limits of how we can meaningfully handle this. But
that's an interesting
makes
point.
Things more interesting.
That the timescales of the current community circuit are not fit to deal with this change, this rapid piece of change. How was that in the crypto? Like, I wonder how it was in the crypto world, because so there's a couple of these spaces where things have been moving like crazy fast. Like front end is one of them. Every week there was a new framework and then like a new compiler and whatever crazy stuff. We had the crypto world where just similarly really rapid changes. Now there's this space where if you're watching nonstop videos and listening nonstop to everything that's being produced, you still can't keep up. Maybe this means that conferences need to change, that they need different patterns. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe a little bit. I think there's this traditional thing of having to like submit basically your talk thingy like 6 months in advance. I think that may be a little bit too long in advance.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think certain things, if you would say, for example, what I submitted basically was just saying, I don't know what the world is going to look like, but I'm sure that there will be something. It's going to be MCP or it's not going to be MCP, but something along those lines that basically allows you to expose APIs into kind of the AI space. And it's just interesting to think about how that changes the way how we design APIs, how we manage them, how we allow people to subscribe to them, how to allow people to use them, right? The whole kind of lifecycle management stuff. So if you keep it that way, I think you can still make a point that, yes, there is going to be something interesting to report, but it's definitely then it's going to be much harder to review those things, right? Because they're not going to say you exactly what it's going to be. They just say there will be something interesting and I'm going to talk about that. So and then people either have to trust you or not, I guess.
Then probably means that it's more like established people that have been longer on the circuits that will actually get the chance because they're being trusted.
For those topics, I mean, if you basically, let's say you're a little bit more of a starter and you would like to talk about specific technologies or specific things you've done, right? Then I think it's going to be really rough if you have to plan ahead for half year in advance.
Yeah. Oh, interesting times for sure.
Yes. Exhausting too, but
yes.
Both of these things at the same time.
Yeah. I think we've covered a really broad range of topics. Is there something that you would like to give a shout out for? You have your YouTube channel. Yeah, maybe a next conference that you'll be presenting. Or is there something specific you would like to pitch to the audience?
Yeah, that's already it, I would say. So yes, please check out my YouTube channel. It's called Getting APIs to Work, or you can just type my name into YouTube. It's probably going to pop up. I haven't been producing as many videos as I had been like a little while ago, just because there's too much stuff going on. But I still try to keep it up a little bit. In terms of conferences, I think conferences might be even more important than they ever were, because it's just important to keep connected with the community, to see what's happening, to just talk to people and get those connections going. Personally, I'm going to be in New York like 3 weeks from now, I think. Yeah. It's going to be API Days, a couple more conferences this year. But it's like the usual drill for me.
Yeah. So people can find you at the API Days typically. I think there's one in Munich coming up in Europe next. Yeah, API Days, they used to have, I think last year I managed to be at all of their events, which were 6. But this year they've added, like you said, they added Munich, they added Amsterdam, they added Bangalore, they added Lagos. So now I think there are 10. And that was a bit much. So I have to be a little bit more selective. Otherwise, I would just spend my life would just be traveling between individual API Days events. That's it's all exciting and interesting, but maybe not too much.
It is, but I also have a job. So I think they would like to see me every now and then. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the conversation, for going along on the philosophy rabbit hole. It's always a great pleasure to talk with you. And I'll see you at one of the upcoming conferences very soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was a lot of fun. I think we should do this every week. It's really But thanks a lot. It was really interesting to talk about all these things. And it's going to be interesting to just see how the space develops.
Great. Thank you, Erik.
Bye, Christoph.
Bye. That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com. And thank you for listening.